Everyone agrees. Shall we begin? No, I'm thinking more folks.
Recording in progress.
All right, I think everyone, more folks are going to be joining here shortly, but it is 6 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and begin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight for our Organic Land Management 101 webinar with Chip and Jay, Beyond Pesticides and Osborne Organics. My name is Lincoln Lake. I am your Developed Parks and Trails Manager and also Interim Superintendent for the City of Missoula Parks and Rec Department. I'd like to start off by introducing Kyra with Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, also Bright Cities, and a little bit of history on how we got started with this process for our organic pilot project for McCormick Park.
Great, thank you so much, Lincoln, and thanks to you all for being here tonight. My name's Kyra, and I'm the mother of three, and I'm based here in Boulder, Colorado. I help to support this work by providing some pilot funding from my organization, which is the national nonprofit Healthy Babies, Bright Futures. Let's see, I had the pleasure of meeting Director Gauntler when this work kicked off. I think that's been a minute now, and I'm thrilled now that Lincoln is guiding this process, and you all are in for a real treat tonight to learn from Jay and Chip. Before I turn it over to them, I just wanted to share a couple of things about our organization. I'm the director of the Bright Cities program at Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, and we give grants up to $35,000 to city governments and community-based partners to equitably reduce their community's exposure to chemicals that harm the developing brain. And you're thinking, why? And many of us don't realize, and I didn't really know this statistic until I joined the team here at Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, that 1 in 6 children in America have a neurological disability. And while the toxic chemicals are not the sole cause for the lifelong learning and developmental delays, they are amongst the most preventable. So I'm so glad you're here tonight, hopefully to pick up some tips to reduce, eliminate pesticide use on your properties, because our future really does depend on it. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Kyra. Really appreciate all that you do. Next, I'd also like to introduce Allison. She's with Grow Safe Missoula, and we got involved shortly after to develop a organic lawn care guide that is available in Missoula for dispersal, and she'd like to talk a little bit about her program and the guide that we've developed.
All right, so there are actually a couple of us from Grow Safe Non-Toxic Missoula here on the call this evening, and we are a volunteer-run nonprofit that is working to reduce toxic pesticides here in Missoula. And that's because we believe that outdoor spaces should be cared for in a way that doesn't hurt us, doesn't hurt our kids, and is safe for the environment as well. We produced a guide to organic lawn care this spring in partnership with Parks and Recreation and the Missoula County Extension Office and a handful of other organizational partners. It offers step-by-step plans for how you can care for your lawn in a safe and healthy way. And we're so lucky that we're here tonight with both Jay Feldman and Chip Osborne. Chip's work is really the foundation on which this guide was created, so we owe a great debt to him. And I know that he's a fantastic speaker as well, so I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot tonight. To find your own copy of the guide, you can go to the Grow Safe website, which is growsafemissoula.org. But then there's also physical copies all over town. So Currents Aquatic Center has them, the Missoula County Extension Office, and then each of the organizational partners, which are All Nations Health Clinic, Climate Smart Missoula, Missoula Butterfly House and Insectarium, the National Wildlife Federation, and Clark Fork Coalition. So I hope you can each get a copy, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks, Allison. We all appreciate it. Really appreciate all the work you and your group have done, and have really enjoyed working with you at the same time. Appreciated. As we move on, I'd like to introduce Chip Osborne, Osborne Organics, and Jay Feldman with Beyond Pesticides. Been working with them since basically I started here with the Parks Department. Very knowledgeable about what they do, and I hope that all of you can really learn a lot from tonight's webinar. I would please ask that everyone please mute to keep any background noise away from the presentation. If you do, please jot down any questions you might have, and we can save those till the end, whether we speak them in person one by one or put them in the chat, but please save questions until the end of the presentation. So Jay Feldman with Beyond Pesticides will start with our why of organic land management.
Thanks, Lincoln, and thanks to the city and to Grow Safe and to Healthy Babies, of course, for underwriting this work. As Lincoln said, I'm going to sort of give you all the perspective that we operate from, and I'm sure you do as well. But to put it into a framework, I'm going to share my screen here and basically explain this holistic approach that we're taking when it comes to looking at land management. So I use the word holistic because I think this is how we are beginning to think and should be thinking as a society, how we interact with the environment, the local ecology, the planet in which we depend on that sustains us. We started as an organization in 1981 because we recognized that we really needed to look at this toxic chemical use, particularly pesticides, and came to quickly realize that much of what we were experiencing in terms of exposure was unacceptable and then also unnecessary, which is why we're here tonight and why, we've been working with the city to really show proof of concept to this concept of unnecessary pesticide use. So over the 40 years or so that we've been operating, we are seeing society move towards safer alternatives, but we still have this continuing dependency on toxic chemicals. So what we're talking about tonight really is in line with our mission as an organization, protecting the fragile web of life that supports the whole ecosystem, and we are among the organisms that rely on a sustainable environment. When we first started, we really began to nurture this concept of an organic system and changing the underlying systems that are inherently dependent on toxic chemical inputs. Why are we using them in practice? And what are the policies doing in terms of allowing continued use? So organic became a methodology and an approach, a systemic approach. We call it a systems approach to eliminate petroleum-based pesticides and synthetic fertilizers that are disruptive of human and ecosystem health, manage soil health, maximize carbon sequestration, and nurture biodiversity. And as the years have gone along, all of these issues have become existential crises. We're seeing elevated rates of disease, which we'll talk about a little bit, pesticide-induced diseases. We're seeing, obviously, the climate emergency or climate crisis, and we're seeing biodiversity collapse. So we're at this critical juncture in which we, at the community level, where we live, can really have dramatic impact on these existential crises. When we're talking about pesticides, I mean, you all know, you buy a product or the city buys a product and you turn that product over and look at the label ingredients and you see active ingredient, you see Roundup, the active ingredient being glyphosate, and then you'll see a percentage of ingredients that are considered or identified as inert, or now increasingly identified as other ingredients. And those are proprietary, they're secret. And we as consumers, as city decision makers, landscapers, don't get access to the information as to what is in that product formulation, the majority of the product formulation. In addition, when you put a chemical out there, you're putting a chemical that degrades in some fashion or transitions to another chemical. So we call that a metabolite, and that's something that we have to be concerned about. We follow the scientific literature very closely, and increasingly, like with glyphosate, AMPA is the short version of the longer technical chemical name, and that turns out to be more toxic in many ways than the actual ingredient, the active ingredient. I skipped over contaminants and impurities. That too is problematic, and also part of the product formulation. Often we have compounds that are a function of the manufacturing process. So this is a complicated subject because it's not as easy to answer the question, what's in the pesticide that we're buying or using, that the city is using? And so, you know, when you get down to having good information to make sound choices, we're really in a challenged position. But we do know a lot. We do know a lot, and we should recognize that. We look at the 40 most commonly used pesticides in lawn and landscape practices and look at these numbers in terms of carcinogenicity, 26, endocrine disruption, 24, 21 birth defects, and so on and so forth. And the same with environmental impacts, 21 are groundwater contaminants, 28 toxic to fish and birds, or toxic to birds, sorry, fish 39, and then 33, you've heard about pollinator health and toxicity to bees. So there are these indirect effects. We don't go out purposely trying to hurt these organisms that are so critical to the sustainability of life, but we do indirectly affect them. We can kill off their habitat. Herbicides used in the urban and agricultural environment kills habitat. We see this with milkweed being eliminated and destruction of the monarch's habitat. And then we use these chemicals in a way that are indiscriminate. So a chemical like the neonicotinoids, which you may have heard about, are taken up by the plant, move through the vascular system, and then they're expressed through the nectar and glutation droplets and pollen. And so foraging insects then pick up the toxic chemical indiscriminately, and they are then harmed as a result of that. Now, this just doesn't happen on its own. There's some underlying laws here that allow this to happen. We as citizens, city governments making decisions, rely on some agency at the state level and at the federal level, our federal government, to make a decision as to its safety and allowing the product on the market. Well, turns out that the underlying law, which has this really odd name, Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, is the law responsible for evaluating these pesticides. And Montana, similar to other states, really rubber stamps what the federal government establishes as allowable practices. And those practices are actually on the label of that pesticide product. There's a saying out there, the label is the law. Well, what does the law mean? And when we dig into this, we find there are severe limitations. We don't look at the effectiveness or the efficacy of a product. We basically assume 100% compliance, and that means people are mixing in and applying it. They're not allowing it to drift or move off the target source into waterways or harm, protected species. The law also doesn't address real world impacts. We're not exposed to just one chemical. If we're using, a chemical on our lawn. The Parks Department may be using another chemical. We're eating residues in our food. We're taking pharmaceuticals. And that's a complex mixture of materials that are not evaluated. And we know there are effects, including synergistic effects. Endocrine disruptions are really problematic area. Obviously, we know the endocrine system is the message system of the body, and it doesn't respond like normal, like we're taught in high school chemistry, that the dose makes the poison, because endocrine disruptors really function at really minuscule doses at critical windows of vulnerability during developmental phases of life. So in the womb, as we're in developmental phases throughout teenage years, and that affects our health. It affects organ systems later in life. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency does not regulate endocrine disruptors under current law that requires endocrine disruption evaluation. It's a huge hole, and it's especially problematic because many of the chemicals that we intersect with on a regular basis that are widely used are endocrine disruptors. The bottom line in all of this is that there are a lot of uncertainties. And those uncertainties have been evaluated by outside agencies, including the Office of Inspector General, which said that, and this is a report that came out in 2017, synergy considerations, these mixtures where you get these elevated risks associated with the mixtures, present a source of uncertainty that might be germane to risk assessments. So risk assessments, when you hear somebody say, well, the pesticide's registered by EPA and the state, that's when you dig into studies like this and say, well, wait a minute, I've read or I've seen studies that indicate that the evaluations are not complete and adequate. So we end up in organic. We end up in organic or with organic because we're trying to look at full systems, as I said earlier. We want to enhance biodiversity, which is a standard, and we want ecological harmony. So how do we make this transition? The justification for this transition is really in the science, and the science is really, fully available to the public, and we try to make it available on a daily basis on our website. This concept of working with nature in a systems approach, which Chip will be addressing tonight, really comes down to the soil. And, we're beginning to understand, I think even those who use chemicals are beginning to understand that healthy soils are teeming with life. And when we use these toxic chemicals, we injure the life in the soil. And that life in the soil is critical to plant life. So we have to garden in a way that strengthens the soil food web. And that's the complex world of soil-dwelling organisms. That's the microbiota in the soil. And this is what you get. So the question of efficacy, the question of results, the question of can we manage a field hockey, softball field, a baseball field, a football field. This is Chip's field in Marblehead, Massachusetts. I showed up one summer afternoon unannounced, and this is what I saw. So you get a beautiful landscape that is more resilient than one dependent on chemicals, retains water, and is a much more effective playing surface. When we do this, we talk about cultural practices we'll be talking about tonight, and we also talk about compatible materials. Now, what we're talking about is not a new concept that is theory. These are tested concepts that have been widely used now in agriculture. Under the Organic Foods Production Act, which is a law that we worked on back in the 80s and finally passed in 1990, to really put out there what we're talking about when it comes to any landscape, any land management system. How do you create an organic system plan? what compatible materials are allowed in that system so that it doesn't adversely impact the soil microorganisms. And how do you have proper oversight? So we borrow some from this federal law that really codifies what organic pioneers have been doing since Robert Rodale, or his father, J.I. Rodale, really introduced this concept in the United States, early 1900s. It starts with a plan, and this is where the system comes in. And what does the plan start with? It starts with proper soil fertility. And how do you do proper fertility? Through the management of organic soil content. So the other element here is this definition and evaluation of allowed materials that are compatible. So we had this earlier conversation about the toxic chemicals allowed in a conventional system, a system that's relying on a chemical intensive system. And that didn't work too well because the agency, EPA, as you saw from those earlier slides, does not adequately evaluate these chemicals. So under the organic law, we come up with a list of allowed and prohibited substances based on different standards that look at no adverse effects and looks at the compatibility with soil microbial life and the ecosystem, and makes a determination at the end of the day whether it's actually needed or not. They call it essentiality. And that's the basic starting block from where we begin when we decide to use a material in organic. We at Beyond Pesticides track these materials. We comment before the National Organic Standards Board on these materials. So this isn't just a guessing game. This is really a scientific process by which we're evaluating materials that are used in organic systems under standards of review that are protective of health, not only those who are playing on the fields, but those who are handling the materials, the landscapers. And we also are working with retailers, because at the end of the day, we want to take this information and make it available to people at their local hardware store and work with providers that can adhere to these standards. So we launched this Parks for Sustainable Future program, and this is part of what we're doing with Lincoln and the city of Missoula to really put into practice these standards, working with Chip Osborne, Osborne Organics, and actually applying these concepts that are driven by our concern for public health, climate, and biodiversity. We're moving away from this risk assessment concept, which has all these uncertainties and all these unanswered questions that were addressed earlier. And we're embracing this notion of a precautionary approach. A precautionary approach which basically says, you know what, we really don't need these materials, and there are all these hazards that have been identified as well as these uncertainties. We're going to take a holistic approach to managing. Now, the result of all of this is quite fascinating. This slide is related to agriculture, and on the right you see organic, and the longer the leaf on this chart, the better, more positive result we're getting in organic. So soil quality obviously is much greater here than it is in a chemical intensive system. And you just go around here in biodiversity, minimizing water pollution. This has to do with agriculture, so profitability. Cost is even competitive and coming down over time. Ecosystem services, meaning we recognize the value of nature. We want to cycle nutrients naturally instead of putting artificial nutrients in the soil. In terms of reducing worker exposure and minimizing residues. So the benefits are holistic and the process is holistic. Now, many of you probably have heard about integrated pest management. We have evolved from integrated pest management. Integrated pest management does not adhere to these principles of holistic management in the way we are doing it with organic. And so while IPM originally started out as a decision-making matrix in which you evaluated pest thresholds and then applied preventive practices or applied mechanical, biological, and left chemicals to a last resort, it really became pesticides in the toolbox. And as a result, this article came out just last year. These are guys and people that have been in agriculture and sustainable development for a long time. And they started out as IPMs 6 decades ago. Some of them have been practicing IPM, and they have concluded that it's lost its way because it's moved from ecological health concerns as a primary to its current state in which usually chemical control methods are central. So we're not knocking IPM as a concept, but the way it's been employed has not held the decision maker to an allowed list and really effectively promoted an ecological approach. Now we're moving into this area of regenerative, and you've heard about the use of the word sustainable. So we have to be careful about these terms and look for definitions and allowable materials. That's Chip looking at the soil. It all starts with the soil. We'll be talking tonight about managing the biomass and feeding the soil, how you do that, how do you manage the biomass, what does soil fertility look like, and what does it get us? What are the results, and what are the long-term benefits? So my message to you tonight, as you can tell already, I'll reiterate it, is that organic really is the only option for a livable future. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and really enjoy working with the Parks and Rec Department on the pilot sites and working through a management system. Our hope, of course, is that when we work through this pilot, we can take the experience and the teachings from that experience and apply it across the board to all the public land practices in the city. The other thing, again, Grow Safe has done a fantastic job, and our hope is that people can take these practices and employ them on their own property. So thank you so much, and I'm going to turn this now over to Chip. And let me just say a couple words about Chip as he gets his slide up, or slides. Chip has been working in landscape management for 4 decades and transitioned to organic over now 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. And the beauty of Chip is that not only is he a skilled practitioner with incredible experience, but he also has served as the chair of his park board, where he grew up and lived in Marblehead, Massachusetts. So he understands the management side, issues of budget, issues of working with the community, and melds the two. And he's a great asset to the city of Missoula in working on these pilot projects. So I'll turn it over to you, Chip.
Well, thanks, Jay. And it's always my distinct honor to work with Jay, to speak with Jay, to be associated with Beyond Pesticides on his board of directors. One of the honors of my life to be involved at that level. And there really isn't much of anything chemical or pesticide related that Jay has not touched over the last 45 years of his life. So trailblazing work, and largely what has got us to this point today in this discussion. But we wouldn't be there without Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, without Grow Safe Missoula, without advocacy groups and support groups that continually raise this issue and bring it to the forefront for discussion. I sort of have been in the trenches, as Jay, over decades in this area, and it can be very contentious at times, and there's an industry side and then our alternative side. And after all these years in doing this, one of my thought processes now is I don't even need to debate the safety of pesticides with anyone because we simply have alternative management strategies that work. And that's the bottom line. If we have something that works that does not involve the use of synthetics, then it really is a no-brainer on how and why we should not employ that. So what I'm going to do today is to walk you through a little bit about what conventional lawn care is. Some of you may be practicing conventional lawn care at the present time, which involves the use of synthetic materials for control products, those things that we refer to as pesticides, or synthetic methods of fertility, like the mostly soluble fertilizers. They're in the 4-step programs and those other sort of quick fix, instant gratification type products. Some of you may be practicing organic land management that does not involve the use of synthetics. Some of you may have properties that are organic by neglect. Wherever you're coming from, the idea is that we can manage, and we can manage successfully without the use of large amounts of synthetics. And what you see here is on a significant estate property. And in the background, there is turf grass that is managed to a pretty high level of expectation. But in the front part of this and on parts of this property, we're embracing genetic diversity. So it does not have to be always pristine. And as I'm talking, I'm going to talk to you about expectations. I'm going to talk to you about how we manage, how we choose to manage. And I guess I want to just set the table by saying we have to always keep in mind that if we have an expectation on what we think grass should look like, we are operating in 2022 under an expectation that was created for us by an industry back in the 1950s. And that industry was selling product. It was selling product to take things that were determined to be undesirable out of the lawn and selling product to synthetically and artificially stimulate that grass. So the expectation of that Better Homes and Gardens lawn was created by an industry to sell product. Not necessarily to grow us the best lawn, but to sell product. So we keep that in mind as I walk through here. Just very quickly, I've been in professional horticulture for 50 years. Half of that, I was in the conventional industry. I bought, mixed, and sprayed all kinds of pesticides and active ingredients in commercial nursery and greenhouse production. 25 years ago, I shifted my horticultural specialty from ornamental horticulture to turf and landscape, but turf and landscape from the organic perspective. Because in my greenhouse and nursery industry, I found I was using all kinds of chemicals, and I was on a treadmill. I was just going from one chemical application to another. And if we embark on a turf grass program that involves the 4-step approach, that's all we're doing. We're simply on a treadmill going from one application to the next. As Jay mentioned, I've been in the public sector for 20 years as an elected official. I've chaired my commission. I managed the budgets, pretty much have guided the ship for that time. At the current time, I'm no longer in the greenhouse industry. I don't have a service business. I don't have a product company. I'm a national consultant that works with a diverse group of clients, teaching how we can move from a conventional approach into a natural approach. And those couple of slides up in the top left there, that is simply a lawn early in the spring in a cool season region of the United States, similar to your temperatures out there. And instead of using pre-emergent crabgrass control, this was a second-year establishment of a lawn, and it struggled through the winter. And instead of using pre-emergent for crabgrass control, we simply brought out the grass seed. We focused on soil biological life and grass seed. And within 2 weeks, we turned that larger picture into that smaller one. So taking steps and strategies that we might not typically think of. Jay gave you a great idea of Pesticide 101. This is my town, Marblehead, Massachusetts, on the East Coast, just north of Boston. And out on the right is the very expensive area of the town. And everything that is applied to all of those lawns there ends up to be in that water. Down in the bottom of the picture is sort of what we call the end of the harbor. And it's a little bit of a beach there. And when I was a boy, 60 years ago, I could walk out there and I could find periwinkles and mussels and clams and crabs. And today, if I walk out, I can go 200 yards and not find anything living because there's an outfall. And all the pesticides and all the synthetic fertilizers that are put on lawns get into storm drains and they're put out there and it's rendered that area sterile. So we're looking to reduce and eliminate toxic pesticides. Really, reduction is possibly a first step, but we rarely focus on elimination because in an organic program, we do not have tolerance for any synthetics. We're looking to protect human health and the environment, protecting pollinators, reducing and eliminating synthetic fertilizers. Synthetic fertilizers are largely water soluble. We'll talk a little bit about that. There are ways that they can be slowed down in their release of nitrogen, but for the most part, they were intended to be rapidly soluble. We're looking to reduce inputs over time. The idea that as we move forward in an organic program and begin to focus on soils and create soil health, we can get a system working where we don't need to put as much in there as we might have had to in the beginning. And we simply want turf and landscapes to get better. And I think in all the projects that Jay and I, are operating at the current time, and I think we must be working in at least 30 plus cities around the country, almost without fail. When we get into a project and then sort of graduate folks from that project, we're leaving things better than we found them. Sorry about that. That's my screen just froze on me here. There we go. So we ask why go organic? These are some of the questions that come up. What is a pesticide? Well, Jay gave you a very good idea on that. I've just given you an idea on synthetic fertilizers. Jay was very clear that we do not have legislation in place that protects us. We know about health risks, or we hopefully are learning about them, and we're learning about the unique vulnerability of children. People, I think, are more familiar with environmental risks than maybe human health risks. And tonight, we're beginning that step to reduce and eliminate exposures, because what is something that I call an awareness through education. An awareness of what we have been doing from a conventional perspective, and then education on how to do it without. So these are all pesticides that are used in lawn care. If you go into a big box store or to your garden centers, you will see all of these products out there. They all are registered by the US EPA. They all have US EPA registration numbers. That bottle up in the top left there, Trimec, that is a cocktail mix of 3 different herbicides, 3 different weed killers, all in that one bottle, because that combination will kill 28 different weeds. Not every weed killer kills all weeds, so they put 3 in the bottle. The quick message on that is no one has ever tested the contents of that bottle 3 ways in combination. In other words, no one from the chemical manufacturer, no one from the US EPA. It's not part of the registration process. The EPA registers active ingredients. They do not register product formulations. Some independent third-party science has begun to test products like this and found that the synergistic effect of 3 different active ingredients together compounds the risk. So we have products like that, grub control, and some of those insecticides that last in the soil season long. So if you see season long, that means that it is there for 180 days. So the idea that we're putting something down and we're going to create a toxic situation for that amount of time. And I won't even dwell on Roundup because I suspect that most people now have heard quite a bit about that. So how does everybody perceive it individually? Are they safe when used as directed? Well, it's actually a violation of federal law to say that. So a service provider, a salesperson, they can't come to you and say, as long as you follow the label, the products are safe, because that's just not true. Have you been told that they're no big deal, that they're dry to the touch? Landscape contractors say that all the time. Once we spray it, once it's dry, it is not an issue. There's something called a half-life of pesticides, and that's how long it takes for half of that active ingredient to break down in the environment. So if the half-life is 20 days, that means it takes 20 days for half of it to go away. So the fact that it's wet or dry makes no difference. The history of pesticides, Jay alluded to Rachel Carson, and the beginning of all of this discussion, they focused on not just DDT, but all different toxins back in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And the history of pesticides basically in lawn and land management began post-World War II, when money had been invested in research and development, chemical warfare, World War I, World War II, and they found out that those materials worked effectively on things, other types of organisms, meaning, plant material. So it began to be actively promoted and brought into the public sector, where we have our sports fields and our public parks and playing fields, college campuses, corporate campuses, and our residential lawns. This is the early years. This is a book that was published in 1956 and again in 1963. And I bring your attention to the left. And even back then, they knew what these were: application of soil poisons. The fact that when they were marketing this in the early 1960s, they knew that these materials were poisons. And they were putting them in the hands of people that were not educated in their use, that had no training, that had no skill set to work with chemicals, yet they were sold and people could buy it and take it home and put it all around their backyard. So that in and of itself is a relatively flawed process, but again, it's marketing. Here's where the American lawn began. This is Long Island, when people started to move post-World War II out of the inner city and move out into some of the first developments on Long Island. This is the way it was laid out. And in those housing developments, when you purchased a house, it was in the purchase and sale agreement that you intended to manage that property with pesticides so that all of those would exhibit the same uniformity of the picture-perfect American lawn and what could happen with the use of weed killers and synthetic forms of nitrogen. So this is how it began, and again, it was again all set up to create this visual. American homeowners account for as much and probably more pesticide use, more pounds of active ingredient than all of conventional agriculture combined. So you think about that the American homeowner uses more pounds of active ingredient of pesticides than agriculture does, all in the quest of that perfect lawn or that expectation that was created by those manufacturers. Federal law defines pesticides as all of these things, but people tell me all the time, well, I don't use any pesticides, I only use herbicides to kill weeds. Well, herbicides are very much pesticides, and we can put them down before a weed seed germinates, and that is called the pre-emergence, like the crabgrass control products, or we can put them down post-emergence, meaning after the weed has started to grow, and then we kill it. And those are known as the weed and feed products because very often those products are combined with fertilizers. And then insecticides, also used in turf, limited fungicides. And, think about it. If you have a swimming pool and you use an algicide, you're putting a pesticide in that pool. US EPA, Jay touched on this, only registers active ingredients, not the final product. And I'll just mention on risk assessment, my last pesticide little slide, this is the framework as Jay described when pesticides are classified. And this looks at negative effects of higher doses, of more concentration of pesticides, the more acute dose. So there's something assigned to it as an LD50 called the lethal dose, and that's the amount that kills the laboratory animal. And that's where risk assessment categorizes pesticides. Science and medicine is now telling us that it is cumulative low-dose exposures, like you would get in your backyard, like you would get on a playing field, like you could get by when you walk on a sidewalk that had been recently sprayed with Roundup. Also in risk assessment, and an LD50, which is extrapolated to 150-pound male, does not take into account a woman, an infant, a toddler, a child, a pregnant woman. None of that is covered under that model. The half-life, I told you about that. This is something that's always puzzled me. This is Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. You may have heard of this, one of the leading hospitals in the world. And I was taking a family member to get chemotherapy and had to cross this lawn, caution pesticide application, to get into that building to receive care. Some companies that manufacture pesticides also are in the business of producing chemotherapy drugs. So we have product line on one side of the company that has serious health issues, and a product line on the other side of the company that creates medicines to take care of some of those issues. So all of these things, everyday practices that we come up against. So we have to assume that there is no level of safety. As somebody that focuses a lot on grass, I mean, I manage the entire landscape chemical-free, whether it's a garden, a tree, a shrub, a bush, or grass. And I do some pretty high-profile grass. There is too much grass in the world. We've been guilty as a society of putting grass where it does not belong. Landscape architects, if they're puzzled sometimes on how to create, the drawing, the diagram on what would go in a landscape, they'll plug grass in there. I've seen municipal buildings where, we have a parking lot and a little strip of grass down the middle. Grass should not even be there in the first place. It only ends up to be weeds and other issues. Some grass should go away, but some must stay. A reasonable amount around our houses if we choose to have a lawn. We may choose turf grass alternatives. That's what this picture is. It's about bringing diversity into the landscape. That could be grass all the way right down to the edge of the stream, but it is genetic diversity that we're after as much as possible. Sports fields, golf, public parks, grass is always going to stay. But that grass that remains needs to be learned how to manage from a non-chemical perspective. So we have different words. Jay talked about a couple of these: natural, organic, sustainable, regenerative management. Regenerative is sort of the new buzzword, but the organic that Jay has been talking about, since the 1980s is in of itself regenerative, because everything that is done in an organic system is to build healthy soils, to leave soils better than we found them. And it's not that regenerative is something brand new. It's really just a different word to describe a good, solid, organic approach to management. So we adopt what Jay and I call a systems-based approach, and we are abandoning the product approach. So they're conceptually different. Product-centric approach, think of the 4-step program, where we are offered 4 bags to buy. flip the bag over. The manufacturer tells us when to put it down, how much to put down, what we're going to expect to see after we put it down. And we put it down, basically by the calendar date. That's the opposite of what we're talking about when we're managing in a system. We're a problem-solving strategy, not a symptom-treating strategy. Pesticides treat symptoms, they don't solve problems. If you had crabgrass in your lawn, people will always say, I have a problem in my lawn, I have crabgrass. Well, crabgrass is the symptom of underlying problems. So crabgrass isn't the problem. The problem may be that you have a bare spot the size of a silver dollar or greater. The soil might be compacted. There may be a chemical imbalance in the soil. Microbial life might not be functioning as well as it should. So we have any of these situations, we're cutting the grass too short. We don't have enough grass plants growing in a square foot. And crabgrass as a weed grass and weed seed is everywhere, and it gets in there and it becomes a problem. So the underlying problems we tick off one at a time. So we end up saying we're going to aerate if we need to relieve compaction. We're going to balance chemistry in the soil by the proper choice of fertility and soil building materials. We're going to buy a good bag of grass seed. I don't use pre-emergence crabgrass controls. My crabgrass control is a good bag of grass seed. I can't solve that problem in 1 month or 2 months like I could if I were using a synthetic pre-emergent product. I'm going to need a year to do that, but sometimes 3 growing seasons in your cool season region of the country. You have a spring growing season and a fall growing season, separated by a period of time in the middle of the summer when it's usually too warm to do much growing in the cool season regions of the country. So soil testing is the basis for our inputs. Nitrogen, however much nitrogen we choose to put on our grass, is based on what our expectations are for the lawn. We'll talk a little bit about that. We're looking in every project we approach, we're looking to leave the soil better than we found it. Organic by neglect is sometimes the general perception. I don't do anything, therefore I'm organic. To us, organic implies a proactive, thoughtful approach to management. So a great definition of what we do is simply putting a series of preventative steps in place to build a resilient system. Because we know that if we, one by one, begin to put these positive steps in place, the system will begin in time to take care of itself. This field, by the way, this is a municipal playing field, and this has been organic for the last 14 years. Let's look at conventional land management and organic land management side by side. Conventional management is synthetic fertilizers, chemical pesticides, generally a quick fix, product-centric approach. Prophylactic use means I'm going to put something down just in case so that I don't have a problem. That may be putting an insecticide down early in the season, just in case there may be a damaging insect at play. It's a symptom treating strategy, and again, it focuses a lot on preventative, preventative from the point of view of chemical applications, and that's what the synthetic crabgrass control does. That is preventative, and that's used in an IPM program that Jay talked about. But there's nothing in an IPM protocol that talks about putting pesticides down before you try non-chemical strategies. Organic land management, natural organic product, soil testing is the foundation for our work. We don't treat symptoms, we solve problems, we focus on microbes in the soil, establish a healthy soil, and cultural practices become very important. We're going to transition. It doesn't happen overnight. There is a period of time that it takes to go from point A to point B. And that lawn you see there is a lawn that it took 2 years to transition That's actually in Maine, pretty far north. And this was in terrible shape. And it really was not much at all. And we simply worked to begin to build healthy soil. We used grass seed, we used a little compost top dressed, we used organic fertilizers. We were no irrigation. This is a non-irrigated site. Once in a while, we'll go out with a hose and water a little bit. So the length of time it takes to transition depends upon the quality of what we start with. Do we have a lot of weed pressures because we haven't been using herbicides? And do we have to repel them and turn it around? That's what happened in this picture. There hadn't been any products used, and it was pretty weedy to begin with. Or have we been using herbicides and other products, and we don't have a lot of weeds, and are we looking to move it organic and keep it that way? However we begin through transition, years ago, people would always say that organic works, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. But once it gets better, it really gets better, and the cost goes down, and it stays that way. Well, with the science that we have now and our approaches that we've developed, rarely do we ever see a project that gets worse before it gets better. We can start right off with our appropriate approaches to it, and things just move in a straight line forward. Expectations that you have can be low, medium, or high. Cultural intensity is what goes in to keep it that way. So you can see the top right and lower left are higher expectation, lower right, modest expectation. So the idea that high expectations not always good, low expectation certainly is not always bad. It's the right expectation for your site that becomes the guideline. You can expect that if you have a lower level of expectation, you can meet that with minimal product and labor input, and that translates to a relatively low cost per 1,000 square feet. If you have a higher level of expectations, that can be met with higher product, higher labor input, and that will translate to a higher cost per 1,000 square feet. This is not a chemical versus an organic issue. This is simply a fact. Think of the 4-step program. If you buy all 4 bags, you're going to get an expectation. If you only buy 2 of those 4 bags, then you're going to get a lesser expectation. So we end up, approaching that, but by no means do we consider moderate expectations to be a bad thing. So now let's jump right into our individual lawns and how we might approach things. Let's look at the soil in a non-forest soil profile. Typical non-forest soil, on average in the United States, 45% of the soil is mineral, 25% is air, 25% is water, and 5% on average is the organic matter fraction. The organic matter can be a little higher, it can be a little bit lower. That varies in different regions of the country on the individual percentages of sand, silt, and clay, and how the organic fraction relates to that. When we look at our management strategies, the organic matter fraction becomes very important because that is the home for the microbial life. So when we embark on a systems-based approach, first thing we're going to do is to focus on the microbial life in the soil. So that 5%, a little more, a little less organic matter becomes very important to us. So when you look at that pie chart, think about picking up a handful of soil. So ideally, a handful of soil should be 45% mineral, and that's the sand, silt, and clay, combined with the 5% organic matter makes 50%. The other half is air pockets, and half of those pockets are filled with air and half of them with moisture. So that handful of soil should be roughly half solid and half air pockets. Air pockets are absolutely critical to growing healthy grass, healthy vegetable garden, healthy trees, whatever it takes. Now, I know in your soils you can have heavy clays. Heavy clays can still have high organic matter fraction, but clay is a fine textured soil. So when we have sand, silt, and clay, clay is microscopic, very fine. Silt is the next smallest, and sand is the largest particle. So in fine textured soils, which are those soils that are high in clay, they can tend to have a lot of surface area and hold on to a lot of nutrients, but may tend to collapse on themselves at times and create situations. I noticed in one of the questions that I saw earlier was, in my heavy clay soil, when I water deeply and thoroughly, it stays wet for too long and can damage my roots. And yes, you have to take that into account, that water is very slow to penetrate and percolate down through a heavy clay soil. Soil testing is our first step. So there's 3 kinds of tests that we do. As a homeowner, I would suggest that you might do the first one. That is basic soil chemistry. I'll talk a little bit about that. Soil textures, the sand, silt, and clay. If you, like landscape contractors, should do that on new construction. The city, working with the city, we've tested all 3 of these. So we know the sand, silt, and clay. We know the chemistry. And then on the city project, on the pilot project, we actually took soil and it went under a microscope. And we identified the living fractions of that soil and how they relate to each other. So we're going to take that probe or a trowel and we're going to go 3 to 5 inches down into the soil. We're going to take multiple samples for each section of lawn or area. If your lawn is it has different microclimates, little different mini ecosystems on the property, meaning bright hot sun from dawn to dusk, or another part of the property could be shaded or maybe moist or a little bit different. We generally separate those out and take 1 test from the sunny area and 1 test from the shady or the or a moist area. Let's just say we're going on a lawn that is sunny, and turf grass is a full sun crop. It loves sun. Even those varieties that say that they're shade tolerant still love the sun. They're just more adaptable to shade. So we're going to go to 7 to 10 different areas around the yard and take samples. We're going to take out a quart-sized baggie, and we're going to fill that about half full, maybe a little bit more, with individual samples. We're going to take it inside, put it out on a paper plate, break it up, let it sit overnight to air dry. The next day, we're going to what I call clean it, meaning remove organic debris, thatch, blades, grass, pieces of the root system. Because when they test for that organic matter fraction that I talked about, they're going to weigh the sample, then they're going to burn it, and then they're going to weigh it. And all the organic material burns off and the mineral stays. So organic matter then is a representation of a portion of the weight of the total soil. So 5% organic matter means 5% of that soil sample by weight was the organic fraction. So put it into a baggie. We're going to take roughly 1 cup of soil, put it into a baggie, send it to a local or regional laboratory, and get a soil chemistry test. Soil chemistry is going to tell us a little bit about the pH, the relative acidity or alkalinity of the soil. You generally have soils out there that are close to neutral, so you're not like we are back in the Northeast where we have very acidic soils. You're going to get the macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, some micronutrients, the lesser important nutrients, although they still have importance, but not in as large amounts. And we're going to be able to find out how well that soil holds on to nutrients, and we're going to get the organic matter fraction. So that is what we get on the soil chemistry test. So then we can design, we can tell what we need to do. And if any of you choose, I've always make the offer that if any of you choose to do a soil test, folks out there have my email contact, and I'm happy to have you send me an email. and I will help you interpret those into real world recommendations. So a couple of little things about soil that we don't think about that are critically important. And one of the reasons a lot of times why lawns get to have lots of weeds that cause us to reach for the weed killers. One of them is a lack of soil structure. Soil structure is simply the arrangement of the solid parts of the soil with those air pockets that are located in there. Microbial life develops and maintains soil structure. So when you pick up a handful of soil and it is light and not light, but generally like sort of fluffy in your hands, that means we have good air pockets in there. We have that 50% airspace with some moisture in there. So we don't think of that, but this is critically important, as is the pore space. This is the oxygen. The microbes that we're talking about absolutely need to have oxygen. The roots of the grass plant absolutely need to have oxygen. So one of the reasons that we aerate soils, and you may have heard that something called an aerator, and I'll show you a picture in a little bit. And we're simply opening up the soil, poking holes in it, pulling cores out of there, getting gas exchange between the atmosphere and the soil. If we don't have pore space and we have an undesirable condition developing and the soil becomes anaerobic. Anaerobic means the absence of oxygen. Once the soil goes anaerobic, turf grass roots struggle and eventually will die. Microbes go dormant and cease to work effectively, and the lawn begins to go into decline. So organic matter, all of these things. One of the questions I saw wanted to know, how can I increase the ability of my soil to hold on to moisture and reduce my need for irrigation? And one of them things is to focus on the organic matter fraction. Organic fertilizer is organic nitrogen, and microbes break that down. That increases the organic matter fraction, therefore increases water holding capacity. As we get a healthier turf grass system, a lot of those roots grow and then they die and they slough off and then they decompose and they passively build organic matter. So organic matter feeds the microbes and improves structure, increases water holding capacity significantly. If we have the ability to top dress with compost, simply taking compost that we make on our own properties or purchasing compost. And I'll show you a couple slides about that, and simply raking that over the grass. That is the quickest way in the short term to build organic matter and this part of the system. So when we talked about the systems approach, it's a threefold concept. It's the integration of three different ideas, three different areas of concentration. One is the acknowledgement that the soil is important and it's biologically alive. The second is the exclusive use of natural organic fertility product. And the third part of it is cultural practices, the things we do to combine with the other two. Things like the right way to water, the right way to cut the grass, aeration for the relief of compaction. We bring that all together into a concept. Soil biology is not by accident number one, because it is the most important. You may have heard the term soil food web. What is biology? How do we best support it? Soil biology is at the heart of the creation and maintaining of structure, plant growth, plant nutrition, disease resistance, the availability of nutrients in the soil. Very quickly, in a 2-minute crash, soil biology course, and some of these terms that you may ring a bell from high school or college classes, but you've heard the terms bacteria and fungi. And in the soil, both of these exist, and they're beneficial. And they're doing all of these different things for us every day that they're down there. These are considered to be the single-celled organisms, the lowest people, the lowest guys on the food chain down there. When we take a bag of organic fertilizer, There's organic nitrogen in that fertilizer. It is not water soluble like synthetic. Synthetic fertilizer, we used to put it down, it said water it in after you put it down because it's water soluble. Organic fertilizer is not water soluble. When we recycle grass clippings, they are not water soluble. There's nitrogen in there, but it's not soluble. Compost, grass clippings, organic fertilizers, all contain organic nitrogen and need to be broken down by bacteria. So these bacteria that are in the soil interact with any of those materials and they get that organic nitrogen in their bodies and they have it broken down. And that's the first step to getting it into the plant. Then we have organisms called protozoa. These guys feed on the bacteria. So the bacteria that has just broken down that nitrogen are now consumed or eaten by these protozoa. And the next step is nitrogen made available to the grass. It's made available little by little, day by day, week by week, month by month. Our goal in an organic program is to get these two groups of organisms working so efficiently over the transition period, that length of time, to get these guys working efficiently so that they can produce more nitrogen on their own and we have to purchase less nitrogen from the bag. If they're not working properly, then we're dependent upon a fertilizer bag. Our goal is to begin to think about moving away from regular and large amounts of fertilizer applications and relying more on this natural system. So we have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are the macronutrients. These are the ones that everybody's heard of. These are the three numbers on the fertilizer bag in that order: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We are now thinking about beyond NPK. Thinking about less is more. The rates that we typically have been taught to put down in conventional are way overboard, and we don't need to put down that much nitrogen. So we're focusing on the biomass. Nutrient cycling is that concept I just described of one organism consuming another. If we put down all kinds of high amounts of or regular fertilizer inputs, microbes just simply don't work that efficiently. This is a concept that, again, goes back to high school science, but look at these products: lawn food, flower food, plant food. I guarantee you there's absolutely no food in any of those packages for any kind of plant material. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are not food for plants. Fertilizer is not plant food. NPK are simply raw materials, the nutrients contained in fertilizers that are catalysts in physiological processes of the plant. So when we put nitrogen down on our lawn, it gets greener, as well as growing blades in the spring and roots in the fall and growing left to right, ideally all the time. But when the grass gets greener, that's chlorophyll. And the chlorophyll is becoming more dense. Then we have the process of photosynthesis, which is simply the green chlorophyll in the blade of grass. We have energy from the sun, carbon dioxide and moisture in the atmosphere, microscopic openings on the underside of the blades of grass that open and close. Carbon dioxide goes right inside that blade of grass or the leaf of a tree or any plant, any green leaf, and has a chemical reaction with the chlorophyll. Carbohydrate, sugars, amino acids are produced. That is plant food. The plant makes its own food in this process of photosynthesis. So 80% of those carbohydrates are pushed down into the root system. Half of those leave the root and go into the soil to feed microbes. So this is part of the process of building healthy soils. Fertilizers can be broken down into these three distinct groups: organic, where we have minerals, plants, and animal byproducts making up all of the components in an organic fertilizer. organic-based are some organic materials along with either a biosolid or a urea type product, a synthetic product. So that's a combination of synthetic and organic-based products are not allowed in true organic programs. And then we have synthetic, which is the Haber-Bosch process, is the development of ammonia and how that is reacted and turned into a 4600 source of nitrogen. Looking at conventional and organic fertilizers side by side. Conventional fertilizers is urea, synthetic, water soluble, fast release, green up, petroleum based, feeds the plant. So it directly feeds the plant, bypasses biology. Biology is generally not required to release this nitrogen. I will say that in some cases, the products have been reacted to require biology, but not in all. Peaks and valleys, price follows the petroleum market. It takes 5 tons of petrochemical equivalent, meaning petroleum and natural gas, to make 1 ton of fertilizer. So it's a 5-ton petroleum-based input to a 1-ton fertilizer output. Natural organic fertilizer, water-insoluble nitrogen, microbes break it down, naturally slow released, it doesn't leach, feeds the soil. So we are now going into a program of thinking about feeding the soil so that the soil in turn feeds the plant. All of these reasons not to use synthetic. Synthetic fertilizers generally have a high salt index. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are mineral salts. So it stands to reason that if we put lots of salt in a soil system, that's not going to make microbial life very happy, and it's not going to function at its maximum. So it upsets the balance of the soil. And synthetic fertilizers have a high leaching component, meaning they don't stay where they're put, generally speaking. So now, we're approaching things very differently. We're not going to go out and just buy bags and put them down, but we're going to look, all these different little circles here are all sources of nutrients that root of the grass plant has accessible to it, inorganic, organic, and biological. And what we end up doing and the way we've developed programs and what we're doing on the pilot sites with the city is we've calculated how much nutrient we're getting from the inorganic, the organic, and the biological fractions, and then the management inputs are what we have to go out and buy. So we only put down what we need. As the soil is producing more for us over time, the purchases and management inputs goes down because inorganic, organic, and biological are all increasing as a result of our chemical-free management. So a sound fertilizer program calls for uniform supply during the growing season if we're managing to the higher expectations. Nitrogen, as I said, is based on your expectation for the property. And think of nitrogen not to green the grass, but think of it as pushing that grass left to right. And that's my #1 defense against weeds. I don't have a lot of products I'm going to be able to talk to you about to put down as a chemical swap. This is what we were doing organic, and this is what this is what we're doing synthetically, and this is what we're going to now do organically. So we're not a product swapping strategy. We're working on building the system to get it to function up, because I don't have a lot of weed killers to swap out. So things like getting that grass to grow left to right as a function of modest nitrogen is one of my first defenses against broadleaf weed pressure. So we're going to fertilize with natural organic fertilizer. Remember, less is more. More frequent low dose applications. We're generally applying nitrogen lower than in the conventional industry. The conventional industry, the label usually says apply 1 pound of nitrogen. We're putting down only 3/4. So if we are trying to do a modest program, here's another transition project here. This was at the end of year 2 In the beginning, it was in a very challenging situation. Think about fertilizing 4 times a year, all low dose. And if you do, this is the way you would do it. Late April, early May, mid-June, mid to late August, late September to early October. That's for the highest expectation. More modest expectations, we can certainly do it less frequently. Top dressing with compost. Compost is the product of an oxygen process. Microbes break it, organic matter down. Can be random materials. It can be made by recipe. It can be purchased. It can be made in the backyard. Good compost has all of these attributes to it. And so it should be rich in organic matter and have abundant microbial life. And it should have some retained nutrients. And we're putting it down just 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch over the lawn. It doesn't have to be high tech. It's not, you don't have to have any great equipment. You can simply put some in a wheelbarrow and, drop little piles and then just rake it around. It takes the place of a fertilizer application. It is not a fertilizer. It's a soil conditioner, but it has definite benefits in the area of fertility, both short and, most importantly, long-term. Compost tea is a liquid extract. Some of you may have heard of compost teas. 100 gallons of a high-quality, aerobically extracted and brewed compost tea contains the same number of organisms as a pickup truck full of compost. So it's a liquid extract of the microbial life in a high-quality compost. More and more, we're finding this as a cornerstone of organic programs in all aspects of the landscape. So now let's moving into a little bit of the cultural practices. The cultural practices are as important as the product side of it. In fact, in programs that I have at times when we're trying to stay, pretty tight to a budget, I'll substitute cultural practices instead of a fertilizer application. I have a horse pasture that I manage that I was on yesterday, and we just found out that 2 of the horses have health issues, older horses that have significant health issues, so they can't ingest high carbohydrates in grass. So all fertility on that pasture has been completely suspended and is simply being replaced by the cultural practice of overseeding and aeration. And aeration simply to introduce oxygen to get the existing turf system to function without supplemental fertilizers. So there's really all different kinds of ways that we can think outside the box. So for mowing practices, the first cultural practice, sharp mower blades. If your lawnmower is not sharp, after you cut, 24 to 48 hours after you'll cut, you'll find a little brownish, grayish cast on the lawn. And when you look closely at the blades, you'll see an 1/8 of an inch of dead tissue right at the tip, at the cut. And that is because that dull mower blade has ripped and torn that edge, and it becomes a jagged edge as opposed to a smooth cut. And simply put, plant juices are leaving the plant. They're oozing out of there, leaving dead tissue. So sharp mower blades, generally trying to cut 1/3 of the length of the blade at any one time. 3 inches is the ideal stress-free height to cut grass. Every university will tell us that. We're leaving clippings on the turf. Don't mow the lawn if the grass is wet. Watering. Grass is damaged by kindness. People equate water with kindness. Overwatering causes more problems than it solves. I say, one of my quotes is, only water turf when it asks for it. In the hottest months of the year, 2 inches weekly should suffice. 1 inch in the shoulder seasons of the year is plenty. And there you can see how much water, 1 inch water will penetrate sand, sandy loams, which is a little bit more clay, and then a clay loam. So water will penetrate. So we're typically looking at delivering 1/2 an inch of water per irrigation if we have an in-ground irrigation system. So not every other day, not 3 times a week necessarily, twice a week, except maybe in the hottest, driest time of the year, if we're looking to sustain, lushness, a little bit more. Cool season turf grass will put itself into dormancy in a non-irrigated site when it gets dry and hot. Compaction is the biggest enemy of turf grass. Simply put, where mechanical downward pressure is squeezing out that pore space. We're losing the pore space. That soil that you see there in the lower right, that is a compacted soil. And you can see those roots are struggling to get in there. There's not a lot of roots in there. That soil is dense. That has collapsed on itself, and there's just not a lot of air pockets in there. So that is an aerator. That is a piece of equipment that can be rented as do-it-yourself. A landscape contractor can provide that. Up in the top left, that's what compacted soil looks like, and that is the end result of compacted soil, because there's no oxygen in there and the grass simply can't survive. So really, people think of aeration as loosening the soil, but the ultimate reason to loosen it is to improve gas exchange and to get oxygen in there. Overseeding in all of the programs that I do is critically important. Paul Sachs owns a company in Vermont, North Country Organics, has been doing this way back since the 80s. And this is his quote. What we tend to not think about is that one grass plant only lives for 1 year and then it dies. Sometimes maybe 1.5 years or 2. But a grass plant is not permanent. The lawn is permanent. That's because we count on regeneration every year. We count on one mother plant producing many offspring to continually keep the lawn thick as individual plants die off. One of the reasons that we overseed is to inject new youth to keep that system thick. So my approach to a homeowner for organic lawn care is to introduce grass seed in the spring to fill bare spots before weed seeds get to be an issue, and then comprehensive overseeding the end of August, early September to thicken the lawn. If we do that for 2 years, after that, we should be able to stop that and simply focus on trying to grow the grass that we now have gotten established. So overseeding combined with aeration is my #1 defense against broadleaf weeds and annual weed grasses. So cool season regions, that's what you are, all non-native species referred to as C3 grasses. There's their ideal soil temperature, their ideal air temperature. It's all about genetics. Grass cannot grow aggressively in 2 directions at the same time. So in the spring, it grows blades and minimal roots. And in the fall, it grows minimal blades and substantial roots. So we can't change that. That's genetics combined with the seasons in the cool season regions of the country. These are the 4 types of grasses that typically are grown in the cool season regions. And everything in this picture that you see here has been organic for 9 years. So there have been no chemicals introduced into this landscape. Prior to my getting involved here, this would have 16 pesticide applications a year, from grass to shrubs to beds to trees. And everything has been replaced with natural protocols. Clover. Does clover have a place in a lawn? Is it a good guy or a bad guy? Well, I'm not the guy that's going to brand it as a bad guy. It fixes atmospheric nitrogen. So clover has the ability to take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere, translocate it into the soil, and supply nitrogen to grass. So it's an entirely beneficial thing. But in the 1950s, we were convinced it was a weed, and they had a product to get rid of that weed. That led to our expectations. So I called them misplaced plants, because other than that crabgrass plant there, these others all have a use, in the landscape in some other place than maybe when they encroach upon our lawn. Grubs are the larval stages of beetle species. I don't know if they have made it, out. I know they're all the way out in the West Coast now. I don't know if you have to deal with them too much up there. But, this is something that we scout and monitor and look for. This is one of the insects that the systems are front-loaded with insecticides, which we do not do anymore. And we have organic materials to treat these guys in August if we ever needed to. Same thing with fungal pathogens. Some regions of the country have more fungal issues than others. And this is a neat test where we're doing this on the pilot site, and we're tracking carbon. So we have tests now that will give us the health and quality of soils. Because what we're doing, the programs that Jay and I do, we're tying it in with a city's climate action plan. And we can look down here. When you look down on the bottom right, down towards the bottom, you will see something called water-soluble carbon. And that is carbon that was once carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, has passed through the grass plant or the tree, has produced carbohydrate, and then has become a root exudate and is now down in the soil being sequestered as an ongoing food source for microbes. So we're tracking carbon sequestration and the ability of a lawn to do that. And then how do you talk to your landscape company? If you do have a landscape contractor, you need to communicate to them what you would like them, to do. Lawn care companies provide product applications, fertilizer, pest control. Maintenance companies, primary's work focus is to cut the grass and do general work around the yard, including the cleanup. Design and install companies that may maintain the landscape after application. So the idea that you want to communicate to them what your desire is and then ask them what they can do for you. Don't be surprised if you hear that it's too expensive and it doesn't really work. Because that is really what the uneducated landscape contractor will say, but the more forward-thinking ones, are learning to get the education and moving forward in knowing that this is the largest growing segment of the land care industry. And just the last quick slides here before I stop and turn back to Lincoln for questions. This is just, I can talk about this, but, I can show you pictures just very quickly how grass can be successfully grown for playing fields or private properties when pesticides are removed from the equation. And managing big spaces like this, all different projects that we're involved in, much harder, than the lawn. Let's see. We're embracing a different strategy, seeking education. We've talked about the conventional. Let me just go through this property here. Is 18 years organic. The idea that we can last that long. The initial cost depends upon site considerations, different expectations during the year. A variety of different sports can be played. All, we're even breaking that 3-inch height cut over there on the right by cutting the grass down to 1.75 inches. Small ball sports. Here's an NCAA soccer field. That's organic at the time of that picture. Everything you see here is 19 years organic. The fact that it does hold up for the long term. Again, expectations, one of our projects, the professional baseball, minor leagues here, that's been organic for 2 years. No synthetics at all on that field, for 2 years. The proof, I say, is in the finished product that, we can do this in our backyards, and we can do it in our large public spaces. So with that, that is is sort of the general overview of what it takes. And I gave you some fertilizer recommendations, some cultural practice strategies. Buying organic fertilizer in your region of the country may be a challenge. One of the things that Jay and I find is some regions of the country are more, it's easier to find a more wide selection of organic products. Certainly a lot can be purchased online, but again, we're working, to try to get product in different regions of the country. So Jay, or Lincoln, I'm going to stop my sharing here and turn it back to you.
Thanks, Chip, and thanks, Jay. Really appreciate all the good information there. It's a lot to take in, but it's really good information. I would like to open it up to questions if anybody has any. If you could, you can use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, or you can just go ahead and put questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer some questions. Let's start with hands raised. Lori, can you go ahead?
Sure. My husband actually was over listening behind me, and he was wondering how, like when you do overseeding, do you increase your water, or do you do the twice a week with seeding like you had mentioned?
So when you seed, when you put grass seed down, it's a two-step process. The first step after contact with moisture, the first step, and it's the germination phase is the first step. And that can be anywhere from 8 or 9 days to 21 days, depending upon the kind of grass seed. The second step is the establishment phase. So in germination, you only want to wet the lawn down about 1/2 inch. So the soil only needs to be wet about 1/2 inch. But it needs to stay moist if it's in the hotter months of the year. That's why we typically do it in the spring or early fall when it's cooler. Once it gets established, then we're after a more deep and thorough irrigation where we want the water to carry down 3 or 4 inches. So at initial seeding, just keeping it moist, and then as it begins to become established, allowing the water to be increased in frequency so that it goes deeper.
Thank you. Can I do a follow-up question? Or do you want me to raise my hand again?
No.
I'm just curious. We have an irrigation system. Like, how do you determine how much water it's getting when it's
Good
coming
question.
out?
Yeah, I'm used to talking for 2 or 3 hours, so I get to cover lots of things. Simply take a tuna fish can. So when an irrigation system is built, it's in zones, right? So you have different zones around the property. Depending upon the installer, each zone should have 2 or 3 sprinkler heads crisscrossing to cover that zone. So what you do is you go to the middle of the crisscross in the middle of the zone and put down a tuna fish can. So when irrigation systems are installed, they usually get set to run 15 minutes 3 times a week. And that's probably the worst way to do it. Because in 15 minutes, I've actually timed it. I've not timed it, but I've actually tracked it on a sprinkler head that goes back and forth like that. It takes 70 seconds to go back and forth. So if it goes 15 minutes, out at the end where those droplets go in 15 minutes, the water is almost negligible. So you typically want to start at 1/2 hour and let the system run for 1/2 hour and look and see what you've collected in the tuna fish can. And then you're after 1/2 inch of water per irrigation. So then sometimes, depending on how that system is built, you may have to go up to 40 minutes. Or if you do have triple coverage, you may be able to go down to 25 or 20 minutes. So that's how you do it. That's how we would do an audit or calibrate, the discharge from an irrigation system.
Lori, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I guess the only other thought I had is where it crisscrosses, is that the most amount of water, or do you get more water closer to?
It all depends on how they hit the design of the system. So there can be, it gets in a little more technical than if you have a misting head, right, which just pops up and it creates a mist, which you have in general narrow areas, that gives the largest volume of water in the shortest time. If you have what's called a rotor head that has a more arced discharge to it, that means that it should be putting some out right beyond the head, some should be going out in the middle, and some should be going way out. So you don't necessarily go out where they just tip like that, but if they overlap like that and you get double coverage, you're getting about halfway out into the throw. And that would give you your maximum amount of water.
Okay, thank you.
Very correct, and thanks, Chip. And, irrigation, when it's designed correctly, should be reaching head to head. So one sprinkler should be reaching all the way to the next for proper coverage. Double coverage is what they call it. The technology involved in irrigation and the nozzles and water dispersion is much better than it used to be. So an older system may not have proper distribution of the water. It may be way more at the end versus in the middle or towards the head itself. Now they do irrigation audits, which, like Chip is saying, they will take cups and literally cover an entire room with cups where they're testing these irrigation heads for proper dispersion of water to where it's even across the entire spray, or like a rain curtain where it's even and not heavier on one end or one space on there. So it all depends on the irrigation system and when it was built, how it was built and designed. And Chip has very good info there on just placing some cups out there and seeing how much water you're actually getting placed onto the ground for your particular irrigation system. We have a question here in the chat. This one might be a good one for Chip. What about when campanula is taken over a large part of the lawn, thick, deep, and tubular roots?
Yeah, campanula is not an easy one, and it's not one that is typically easy to crowd out through just turf density by the nature of the way the plant grows. So if you have a situation where that has taken over a large part, I'm guessing that post-emergent herbicides have not been used because, synthetics, would take that out. There is a chelated iron product that possibly, could do it as a mostly organic product. Oh gosh, I forget the name of it. It's marketed in the commercial industry as Fiesta, but in the homeowner industry, it's on the Gardens Alive catalog, and it's an iron chelate, and iron gets in there and disrupts the plant. But whether or not it would get down into that type of a thick root system, I don't know. That potentially could be a manual eradication, and as much as people don't want to hear that, there are situations where if we are trying to move away from, synthetics for control, there are times when it comes to manual eradication, and it could be that part of the lawn, if it's substantial, would just simply need to be, take the turf, take it up, and pulling those roots out, and then resoiling if need be, and then starting over again.
Chip, would also maybe an aeration, whether you're pulling plugs or even a deep tine aeration and then application of that product, assist with those deep roots and getting rid of those plants?
Aeration could possibly fracture some of that root system. As a greenhouse guy, I know that Campanula is aggressive and regenerative and has the ability to, come back again. So, it may provide, but if we were doing that, then it would, if we're going to take a strictly cultural approach, we could aerate. I would maybe introduce some compost as a top dress and then overseed heavily using, 5 to 7 pounds of grass seed per 1,000 square feet and try to reestablish some reasonable density as quickly as possible. So aeration, fertilization, a little bit of compost, grass seed, and trying that in, say, the first week of September.
Excellent. Thanks, Chip. I think you may have just answered Martha's question here as well on the best process for aeration, fertilization, some top dress, and then overseeding. Martha, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I just assumed that you need to do the aeration and then seed it. But I think I have never seeded to the amount that you're talking about when you say 5 to 7 pounds per 1,000 square feet.
A lot of it depends on the kind of seed, that you're doing. When all grass seed is not equal. So Kentucky bluegrass. So you have Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, and perennial ryegrass are the 3 grasses that you can seed with. Kentucky bluegrass has 1.2 million seeds to a pound. Fescue and ryegrass only has 300,000 or 400,000. So it's a very big seed. So if you're using a fescue blend or mixture, you need a whole lot more seed than you do if you have something that's high in bluegrass. So that's a mistake that people make a lot of times, is they may only put 2 or 3 pounds per 1,000 of grass seed, but it really is not. If we're using the larger genetic seeds, we're just simply not getting enough plants in there to really get that aggressive pushback that we're trying to do. And grass, grass is a thug. And, grass will push back against a lot of the broadleaf weeds. We just need to get it in there in the right amounts. And absolutely right, aeration first. We could simply aerate and overseed. And as that plug comes up and sits on there, that plug breaks down and provides a little bit of a seed bed to germinate, all that new seed. If we aerate and then put some compost as a top dress, now the compost falls right down into those core holes, changes the soil down at the 3-inch range, also provides a seed bed along the surface and facilitates in the germination of seed. Fertilization after aeration is also a great thing, because that's dropping some of the fertilizer right down into those holes where it can very quickly, stimulate to make a change.
And just to follow up on that, Chip, it's kind of prescriptive as well, because no yard is the same, correct? So it all depends on your soil, but also the weed pressures that you have. So if you're very heavy on the weed pressures, then you're going to have to put a little more work into it and a little more overseeding as well. If you only have some weeds, then you're not going to need to apply as much seed to give that pushback to those weeds. Am I correct, Chip?
Yeah, this is where organic is, we try to teach that it's somewhat site specific, meaning it's adapted to the site. So unlike the 4-step program where you've got the 4 bags and you put it down, we, don't have one set program, but we have the flexibility to let site considerations dictate our strategies. And we do what we need to do to the level of intensity that we need to perform it based on site analysis, site considerations, and expectations.
I have another question, if I
Sure.
can. So if I'm going to seed in the spring, my front yard gets super baked in the summer, and I don't like using a lot of water. But if there are like new plants from the spring, do I need to really keep watering to keep them alive?
Yeah, unfortunately, water is essential to life. So a newly germinated and established grass plant has some need of water to get it through until it gets strong enough to then go into dormancy and emerge from that dormancy in a healthy manner. So if we seeded in the spring and say we got great germination through the month of May and early June, and we, had all these young, thick, plants, all these young plants had gotten up to that big, and they were nice and everything was fine on natural season or minimal water. And then we got into really hot weather. Once they burned out, they're not going to go into dormancy, but they're going to die because they're just not strong enough to get there. Once they get strong enough, then the absence of water will cause them to go into dormancy. It's all about building up those carbohydrates and photosynthesis and getting the plant to build up its reservoir of its own food sources. And that does take a little bit of time for that to happen.
Thanks, Chip. Brandon has a question here. Him and his neighbors split an aerator rental. Do you have a recommendation for a type or certain brand or anything of a particular aerator for homeowners to use?
No, when rental equipment, you definitely will be renting a core aerator. So there's multiple different types of of aerators that you could purchase. But to rent, it's pretty much, a core aerator that will pull, hopefully a 3-inch plug. A good one will pull 3 to 4. A not so good one will pull 2 inches. Environmentally friendly, they're all gas powered at this point. I don't, that because of the intensity of the machine, I don't know, Lincoln, if you know of battery powered aerators at this point, but it's a kind of piece of equipment that really needs the high push of a gas engine. So, unfortunately, that's still one that's probably not, the most environmentally friendly, but then again, it's not like a lawnmower that you're using it every 7 days. You'd use it once, maybe twice a year tops.
Exactly, Chip. And at the same time, there are, a handful of different types of aeration. Like Chip is saying, typically you're going for plug aeration, which is pulling, small finger-sized pieces of soil out of the ground and tossing them up top. There's slice aeration. There's deep tine aeration with a larger machine that may go 6 to 7, maybe even 8 inches deep. But also, this is all site specific. So depending on your soil type or where you're at, you may not get more than an inch into the ground. If your soil is deeply compacted or if you have a lot of rock, we're in the Rocky Mountains. We got to remember that too, because certain sites that we have in parks, we have tried 3 to 4 inch tine aerators and only gotten an inch deep and broken tines off with bigger equipment. So it is all site specific. But as you continue this process of aerating, overseeding, and top dressing, you're adding to that soil and you're building on it. So eventually you're going to build a deeper level of topsoil to improve that soil health. But it all depends on what you're actually starting with. Lori, another question?
Yes, and I know that I kind of feel like this might be a dumb question, but I have to ask it because I'm not really clear. So if I'm doing this kind of for the first time and I've aerated my lawn and I seeded my lawn and I want to like try to determine what to put on it next, and I know again it's site specific and it's also soil specific, but let's say like, I mean, yes, I want to test my soil first, but like I'm kind of anxious to get going. So like, is there a product, like one product that I should be putting on there now in terms of adding nitrogen, or should I just wait for the soil testing? And then how do I determine which product? I just feel like there's so many things out there. I don't know where to go, like what to do.
Yeah, so when you choose, you can get started without a soil test. Think of the I'm going back to the 4-step program again, where you're buying something that's you focused on the grass, right? You focused on the lawn, and this product has you focusing on what you can see. In the programs that we're talking about, we're putting an equal focus on what we can see above ground and what we can't see below ground, right? So that's as important as that. So when you choose product, we want it to do two different things. We want it to stimulate and meet the needs of the grass so it can go into photosynthesis and reproduce and do all those things. And we also want to have food for the microbes. So organic fertilizer does both of those. So it's food for the microbes, and as the microbes use that as a food source, the conversion is happening into plant available nitrogen. There's other products that are carbon-based. Compost, think of compost. Compost is largely humus. Humus is stabilized carbon. Carbon is energy for the microbes. So a humate, liquid humic acid, granular humates, those kinds of things are stimulus for the microbes. So very often we could aerate and put down some type of carbon for the microbes and get a huge benefit, and we don't even have to visit nitrogen. So I don't know, Lincoln, whether, we can get to a point of helping to develop a resource out there of maybe as a follow-up for this, or as a next step of what, we've been working through, the issues with you guys about, product and sourcing product and things like that. Potentially, maybe we can, start an initiative, and maybe GrowSafe could be involved in this, of helping. One of the first things when I started in 1997, my pesticide awareness, organic lawn care in my own town, the first thing we did was identify local resources. What was there for product? Where could we, because I stand up in front of a group and talk, but if I couldn't tell them where they could find something, then it just became an abstract. So one of the first things that we did as an early on advocacy group was to try to determine what product was available in our local marketplace that we could point people towards, without, of course, recommending by brand name or steering to somebody to submit, but a list of products as they might be available in Greater Missoula. So that may be something that we could all collaborate on to try to build that resource. I don't know, Allison, what do you think? You think maybe that could be something that could be a next step from this as part of compiling that homeowner body of information?
We'll have to talk as a group, but we have a meeting coming up, and I'll definitely put that on our agenda.
And we have kind of done that a little bit in the guide where we tried to connect, bring in supporters and advertisers that would have some of these products. It's just, I guess we don't have a ton.
And we have at least 2 of those people have been on the call. We have Chuck Holman from Earth and Hand on here and Jason Duffin from the Garden City Compost. So
Would they like to show themselves and say hi to everybody?
Hi, everyone. I'm Chuck from Earth and Hand.
Nice to meet you, Chuck. I've heard a lot about you.
Good, thank you. So one of the things I put in chat, I'll let Jason introduce himself. I see he's on now. Got to unmute too, Duff.
There we go. Is that better?
Can you
That's
see it?
better.
All right. Yeah, that helps. Good to see everybody. Jason Duffin, Garden City Compost. Chip, Jay, both great to see you both again. Lincoln, thank you.
Likewise.
Gloria, Allison. Ann, thank you very much. Chuck, good to see you. Please go ahead, buddy.
Yeah, a quick question for you, Chip. I mean, when you're testing, are you basing your on a base saturation, or are you looking at saturated paste? Which one have you found in your experience gives you, better pathways to the results you're looking for?
I do both. I do everything from base saturation to saturated paste to tissue analysis to find out tracking what's starting here and getting in there. But for the most part, the starting point would do base saturation.
Okay.
Well, and another question in the chat here from Martha, recommendations for who to send soil samples to for chemistry testing. The experience that I have, which is not extensive, we've always had to send it away, and it's kind of on a time constraint, so it doesn't get dried out and not accurate. I do believe that Chuck may do some, with Earth and Hand, may do some local soil testing. Is that correct, Chuck?
I gather tests, but I do send it to an analytical lab. I'm not trained nor set up to do that. Mostly, the biggest thing with soil tests is you always want to use the same lab, because every lab is different. But then as Chip said, interpreting those tests and, it's like, oh, this is my, I got 54%, say calcium, and what's it supposed to be, and what do I got to do to get there? So that's more of what I help people out with, is those recommendations. And then not only, as you're doing those mineral testings and adding those minerals, you're not always likely to see instant results. As Chip said, it's a process. So, also there's, constructed biologicals that focus on certain minerals that you can put on, and, and just introducing folks to those as well, and to be able to get the results they want to see quicker. So like Chip said, you don't have to go worse before it gets better. It can just get better and continue to grow.
Chip, I had a quick question about fertilizers. I found it really confusing, all the options that there are for organic fertilizers, and ended up going with a fish and bone meal blend. But I think that's one of the things that's really challenging for people who aren't professionals in the industry, is like, what does this mean? What's the best?
Well, typically, back in the day, we talked about balanced fertilizers, and the 3 numbers are the analysis, and then there's a ratio of N to P to K, nitrogen to phosphorus, potassium. With what we know now and the issues that we are facing, most turf grass should be fertilized with 0 phosphorus fertilizers. Phosphorus is not needed in large amounts by the turf grass plant. So when we fertilize a lawn, that when we have any significant phosphorus in there, it becomes a cumulative buildup in the soil because turf grass doesn't process it out rapidly like an agricultural crop might. So when we apply phosphate to an ag field, that crop takes it away and brings it up, and that's in the produce or the fruit. Grass doesn't do that. It is essential for photosynthesis and respiration in small amounts. Typically, phosphorus-free organic fertilizers are not the easiest thing to find in all regions of the country. Jay and I are working on an initiative to try to make them more readily available around. So if that can be found, there's plenty of synthetic, because synthetics created in the laboratory. So they take N and they take P and they take K and put it together in some combination, and they can simply leave out the phosphorus. Organic sources of nitrogen, for the most part, equate to having some phosphorus in there, especially if there's certain feedstocks that go into the production of them. I use a lot of soybean, so soy and sulfate of potash, or soy and feather meal and sulfate of potash can be combined to make a phosphorus-free fertilizer. So, that's sort of where we're going in the industry, is to try to get that more readily available. But, most organic fertilizers are going to have a nitrogen percentage between 5 and 10. So you're generally not ever going to find a nitrogen analysis. That first number on the bag will always generally be, maybe even 4 and 10, would be where you would find it. So you're not going to find that first number in the teens and 20s and above. So, but it doesn't mean it's any less effective, and doesn't mean that it's not going to work. It's just that it works in a different mode of action.
Dana has a question. Is there a way to smooth out a super bumpy lawn? Wasn't great, but it got even more bumpy after irrigation was installed. You want to throw at that a little bit, Chip? Maybe I'll chime in after.
Yeah, I mean, it can be rolled. You can roll it to, so do it up, but you need to counteract the rolling process with aeration if that will do it. It's not necessarily going to be pressed down and then, the low spot's going to pop back up so that it all becomes even. So it may involve some topsoil, if there's a depression, if you can roll it, get a little bit of that. You may have to, put a little bit of soil on there and but you can't cover grass with any more than a half an inch of soil at any one time. If you start to get too thick, you're going to really damage the crowns of the grass plant. So if it's simply bumpy from irrigation trenching, going in there, if the installer didn't properly get it to meet back down and to come down, the first thing I would try would be to, when the soil is somewhat moist, try to roll it with a roller. But then realize that you may be compacting to some degree, and you may want to offset that with an aeration.
Very good points, Chip. And it's all dependent on the site at the same time as well, and how bad it is, whether you're filling a divot or if you have actual upward bumps. Sometimes if you get the soil a little bit moist and roll it, then you can even it out. That may end up in compaction, and you have to come back and aerate. But also at the same time, if you have heavy ups and downs and bumps, sometimes that requires some mechanical removal. If it's some pretty heavy lumps and bumps out there, it may require a shovel or even some machinery out there to remove the material and place it in the low spots, or even just get rid of it at the same time. One thing I wanted to mention to everyone else at the same time, I forgot to earlier when we were talking about aeration, especially deep tine, if you're going that way. Most irrigation systems, it depends on where you're at and who installed it. But when you're aerating, you got to realize that you are stabbing holes into the soil and your pipes are under the soil. So depending on who installed it and how deep they buried it, there's a good chance that you may end up poking holes into your irrigation pipes. So always get your irrigation heads and valve box located before you aerate. And if you're going for a new installation of an irrigation system, always ask for an as-built. An as-built being a drawing of where approximately they put those lines into the ground, and have eyes on the installation at the same time so you know how deep they put those pipes into the ground. Because you don't want to turn your irrigation pipes into Swiss cheese while you're aerating.
That happened in one of my municipal parks where this sports group hired a landscape company to pull irrigation through a football field, and they pulled it through at homeowner depth of 4 inches, and it was put a big aerator on there and $5,000 worth of damage in like an hour and a half. Yeah.
Thank you, Lori, for putting into the chat. Becky did mention that this will be available later on MCAT's video on demand, MCAT.org or the MCAT app after the 29th. Also, it's going to be broadcast on MCAT channel 189 on May 20th at 5 p.m., May 21st at 7 p.m. Do we have any other questions from the group?
And I think you're still on mute.
Is that better?
That's better.
Okay, good. Sorry. I've been noticing advertisements for Sunday as a company that provides, they say, more organic, less chemical lawn care products. Have you guys have any, Chip or Jay, do you have any comments? Have you seen that?
I have,
Yeah.
and I did a little homework into it, and it does have some organic, but I believe it has some in there that's not organic. So I think it's a hybrid product that has some of both. And that's how, because the synthetic nitrogen is way less expensive than organic nitrogen. So that's how they can keep it affordable. I don't know the exact, breakdowns, but I remember looking into it last year when it first came out.
It might be a step in the right direction, maybe.
Well, it's tricky. I spoke to the owner, and Chip's right. I mean, the issue was the fertility, mostly the synthetic fertility. And it's really hard to do an organic program with synthetic fertility because you're not embracing the basic soil biology.
Yeah.
And so, I think the owner felt that he had to meet expectations in a way that was easy, in a box, right?
Right,
So he could sell this subscription and get really quick green up, which is the expectation of the homeowner, as opposed to sort of working people through the process of building a more resilient lawn.
Right. No, it's too bad.
Jason, you got your hand up. You got a question?
Yeah, not quite a question. I apologize for the connectivity issues. I've got, I think it's the jack on my laptop. I left off when Chuck was talking about local testing and everything. I know the county extension office can help with that here. And then we also have we personally use a soil test lab over in Moses Lake. I don't know if you mentioned that or either one of those two. But for just doing a general soil test, if you're really curious, or if you're growing a crop that you want to know what to add into that crop, it was only like between $60 and $90 to do something like that. So we do have some local assets that are pretty easy to work with and can help all of you out if you're curious to. Again, that's Soil Test Farm Consultants in Moses Lake, Idaho.
Thanks, Jason. Really appreciate that. Do we have any other questions? Well, thank you, Chip, and thank you, Jay, for your excellent presentation, all the information. Thank you, Allison, and I know Kyra already left, and Allison and group, and everyone else that's been involved in this. Really appreciate all your help and assistance to the community. Unless anybody else has anything else to say, I think we did pretty good.
Keep up the good work, you two, Chip and Jay.
Thank you.
Thank
So nice to
you.
meet you
Well,
all.
we really do
Thank
appreciate
you.
the opportunity to work with the community. So thanks to the Parks Department for having us be a partner in this effort, and thanks to the Grow Safe Montana or Missoula, sorry, in really being a moving force behind all this. So we appreciate that.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks a
You
lot,
learned
everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.